Hi there, this is Chris from MoneyHub, and this video looks at making sure you understand the exclusions as part of your travel insurance policy. So we're going to look at cover from one cover, we're going to look at cover more, and we're going to look at Southern Cross. These are all popular travel insurance policies. Of course, there's a wide market out there, so they're not the only ones, but we wanted to go through and just look at these general exclusions. Now, before I start, I want to make it clear that these exclusions are not, all of the exclusions, because if you look at your insurance policy, you'll find that, there's going to be limited cover on certain things. So if you say lose something and it's valued at $5,000, but your cover is only for 1,000, then you're pretty much excluded from the $4,000 of, payout that you would like to replace the item, things like that. Same for cancellation cost. If it's got a cap on it, then you'll be excluded from the rest of the benefit. But to make it clear that these are just general behavioral or situational things, which travel insurance have just said, we're not going to cover for this because it's too risky. And why would we want to get involved in this? This is not what we do. We're looking at medical things. We're looking at, lost luggage. We're looking at cancelled flights and stuff. We're not going to insure you for all these other variables. So let's just go through them and understand what they are. Please have a look at this before you buy any insurance policy. Make sure you understand exactly what's in it, so you have, confidence what you're buying. So this is the Southern Cross policy. I'm just going to quickly go through all of these, so that's not me reading them word for word, just so that you understand exactly, what's out there. So things like biological or chemical weapons, anything claimed to do with that, you won't be covered. So government or official directives, closing borders, if there's a new pandemic, some sort of lockdown claims there, seizing items, say you bring in stuff that's not legal, then it gets seized, there's no claim for that. So those are the kind of exclusions from there. Natural events, this is where you go somewhere and there's already the natural event on, and you get there and you know that, and you fly in or you arrive, and then you have a claim because of it. So it's sort of termed as the natural event has occurred before the date your journey starts. So it's probably going to be covered. And of course, I can't give insurance advice. If you're already on a multi-trip journey and you get disrupted due to a natural event, but if you're already, but if you flew somewhere knowing that, that it was on, well, then you wouldn't be covered in the plain reading of this. But of course, if you have any questions, you need to talk to the insurer. This is why it's really important to read the fine print line by line, just so that you have an understanding. And we would suggest printing it out, sort of highlighting stuff, circling it, and phoning up the insurer to get a sort of confirmation. Because you can see here, this is page 86. So there's quite a lot to digest, and we don't want anyone to have a failed claim because they didn't, understand what they were buying. So the rest of the exclusions, there's things on nuclear, there's things on war and violence. Now, of course, the exception of this, if you've already left and you're in somewhere and this thing starts before you knew, and at the same time you do your best to try and avoid it. So there's all these sort of pitfalls and things you have to be aware of, just knowing exactly, what's going on. So anything to do, if you work as a flight crew, you're not going to be covered. Cruises, you'd need to have additional cover. It's normal for self-insurance policies now, and we have separate guide on cruise travel insurance, because there's lots of things people need to know which are specific to cruises, of course. And then hitchhiking. So if you do hitchhike, or if you pick someone up and there's a claim, say something gets stolen, something else, then there's no cover. And then traveling by charter vessel, this is when you are hiring a yacht or like some sort of ship or a boat. That's going to be covered if your vessel is crewed and if you're traveling, within coastal sort of inland waters. But if you hire a boat and sail it to Australia by yourself, then there'll be no cover there, for example. And then where you haven't paid a fare for the air or the sea travel. So these are just very specific, less specific exceptions. Um, but it's usually around crewing or things like that, or some sort of specific tour. But you will be covered if you say use frequent flyer points, flybys, or something else sort of loyalty based, and that you bought a ticket and then you're traveling as part of a prize. So you can see how specific this is, but it is important to sort of like get an understanding. And then work, so you're not going to be covered for anything, including volunteer work. But there will be some exceptions, of course, if you're just there for a short time, usually trade fairs, a conference, a meeting, some sort of course, and non-manual work. Say you're in an office. But if you go off to Scotland for 3 months to shear sheep, then you wouldn't be covered by a general travel insurance policy from Southern Cross, from what we can see within these exceptions. And then changes to your health. And so you're not going to be covered for things which are undiagnosed. And then also newly diagnosed. Of course, there are exceptions. So if this is you, I'm not going to go into it, then contact the insurer to understand exactly what's going on and what they actually cover, because everyone's medical conditions is different. And then further on to the medical conditions, you're not going to be covered for travel exhaustion. So if you travel too much, and claims there. So anything to do with, with STDs or STIs, unless it's certain covered conditions. Travel against medical advice. So if your GP says, please don't travel, or you must not travel, and you still travel, and then there's a claim, you're not going to be covered for that. And then you refuse to return to New Zealand, that's not going to, be covered there. And then sort of similar things from that. So just be aware, of course, anything to do with illness, as I say, read through the policy thoroughly. Pre-existing medical conditions, they're not going to be covered. You need to declare them. That's, some of them are, there are some which are generally accepted, but you need to understand the policy in detail there. Pregnancy, so we have a dedicated guide to this. This is where you're going to be within, in the case of Southern Cross, you're covered up until the end of the 24th week. But at the same time, there's certain things you won't be covered for. So it's really important to know when the limits are, because look, it does say after the 24th week. So know exactly when that is, and then make a decision accordingly with regards to whether or not you'd want this policy, if that applies to you. Private hospital medical treatment, where it's funded by New Zealand, that's not going to be covered. Self-harm, that's not going to be covered either. Sports and activities, so taking part in these things like bungee jumping, parachuting. Now, of course, there are going to be exceptions to that when you take part with a licensed operator. You follow their safety instructions and wear all the safety requirements. So just be aware, if you did a tour that was, say, some sort of fun yaks, and they were licensed, then that would seem to be fine. But you need to, if you do have questions about this, ask the insurer. So that is something to be aware of there. And any activity where you don't follow the instructions, and then competitions for money, that's not going to be covered. So if you are doing some sort of downhill ski racing, or that's not going to be covered. And then contact sport, and that's not covered either. So if you get injured playing rugby overseas, even if it's socially, then you're not going to be covered for that as well. And that's covering deliberate or incidental. So, of course, if you're tackled and end up with a broken shoulder, then that's going to be not a claim which seems to be able to be processed. But if you have any concerns before that, just talk to the insurer, because they'll be able to explain it much better than I am. Extreme sport, sorry. So things like hunting, kite surfing, motorsports, rodeo, skydiving, that seems to not have that exclusion of the licensed operator. So you may not be covered. It looks as though you won't. And then mountaineering, trekking, or trapping, but there are some exceptions to that. So basically you just have to understand the policy, and then it carries on further. So ocean yachting, that's if you're not within 12 miles or 22.2 k's of populated land. So if you are actually out in the ocean, and then professional sport, of course, blanket is excluded. Anytime so like racing, with the exception of racing on foot. So if you did, say, a marathon, you'd be covered. But if you did racing in a car in, say, Nuremberg Ring, then you would not be covered if you had an accident there. And remote touring, if you're part of an organized tour, that's fine. But if you're doing it by yourself and where there's no sort of medical services or any sort of phones, then, so that's excluded. And then riding a moped or a motorbike, where it includes you being driving, sorry, or being the passenger, that's excluded. But at the same time, Southern Cross actually has like an add-on policy for mopeds. So it's another thing you do need to be aware that there are situations where, okay, they'll cover you, but you have to pay more. Skiing and snowboarding, and so this is this is also an add-on policy. Uh, at the end of time, that you're skiing or snowboarding on a mountain or ski or snowboard during your journey, you only have cover as per the optional. So once again, that's an optional, and you chose so you will be covered when you chose the add-on option, you pay the extra premium on your certificate of insurance. So these are things you need to be aware of. Underwater activities. Once again, you've got to sort of be aware of like what's covered, what's not covered. So if you hold a certificate, say like a PADY, like the PADI certificate, then yes, that sounds fine. Or you're with a qualified instructor, sure. But if you're not and something goes wrong, then it looks like no cover. And then putting yourself in danger, solvents and drugs, things like that, with the exception of if something's prescribed to you, anything to do with illegal activities, that's not going to, any claims to do with that, you're not going to be covered. Personal safety, where you risk it, and the exception there is when you've tried to save someone's life. So if you have a claim because you were saving someone from drowning and then got into difficulty yourself and needed hospital treatment, then you could say that you've risked your personal safety, but you've tried to save someone's life. So, or you've saved someone's life. So then there will be cover. So these are why travel insurers get a bad reputation, because they go through everything with a fine tooth comb, and there's lots of exceptions, but it's just good to know how it all works. And then further on, so anything to do with prostitution, scams, and frauds, travel advisory issued before the date of your insurance starts. So if you've booked somewhere and it's on the red map for safe travel, it's on like a do not advise to travel or do not travel, then and you travel there, then you're not going to be covered if that's already a pre-existing warning, and then you book your travel insurance. And then travel advisory is going to be that's issued between the date that your insurance starts and the date that your journey starts. So in such a situation there, what they're saying is that looking at cancelling your policy, that's the only way you could kind of proceed, because you're not going to be covered if you go to these countries with that type of situation in. But of course, you have to make sure that you have sufficient cancellation currents, sufficient cancellation cover. And in the case of Southern Cross, it's preset at quite a small amount. So you need to be aware that that may not be enough. So these are all things to sort of consider. If I just carry on here, travel, and then something to do with unknown people. So someone invited to your accommodation, or visiting a stranger's accommodation. So if someone comes to your house or your hotel, or you visit them and say your phone gets stolen or anything like that, then there's no cover. And then with regards to sort of the other section, you're going to have some exclusions around animals. So an animal that belongs to you or a relevant person is not going to be part of an insurance policy. Neither is consequential loss. And this is all loss of income, loss of value, something to do with any type of loss. Put an example here, and basically, traveling, he's offered $1,000 to take photos of a wedding. He drops his camera. He can make the claim for the camera, but he can't claim for the $1,000 that he was going to be offered to shoot the a wedding. So that's also very useful to know. Non-financial losses, the ability, so the loss of ability to enjoy something, and then other persons' losses. There's just so many examples here. I think it's best just to read through them. And then if you haven't followed, for example, Southern Cross's instructions, and they've given you instructions on the emergency line, then, and you haven't followed that, then you're not going to be covered either. And the period of insurance, say you're claiming outside of it, say your policy ended on the 20th of May, but you decided to carry on and you needed to make a claim on the 29th of May for something that happened on the 29th of May, then you wouldn't be covered because you're 9 days out of the policy. And then relationships, anything to do with divorce, at the same time, there are exceptions to that when you've experienced family violence and things like that. So you really need to have a read through this. I can't say that enough. There's a definition there, and then services from friends and family. So if you've received healthcare, accommodation, meals, or transport, you paid a family or friend for, then you can't claim on those. So that takes you to the end of the Southern Cross policy. And then if I just quickly look through the general exclusions for Covermore, if you're prepared to carry on while I do this, it's important just to really get an understanding. It's pretty similar. So they're not going to cover you for any loss, damage, or additional expense following from a claim that is not covered under the insurance. So it could be the cost of replacing locks after losing keys, a cost incurred in preparing a claim, or a loss of enjoyment. So this is once again not as beautifully presented as the policy from Southern Cross, and you do need to sort of read it more intensely because it's a little bit smaller, the lettering, and yeah, it's just a little bit harder. So claims arising from a loss, death, or damage to property, if you fail to take reasonable care to put yourself in a situation where you can see that loss, and then it goes on from there. So I'm going to, loss or damage caused by detention, confiscation, or destruction by customs or other government officials or some sort of authority, that's not going to be covered. Claims arising from travel booked or undertaken by you that you knew or had a reasonable person would know that you were unfit to travel, and whether or not you had sought medical advice. So that's if you know you're very sick and you know that you shouldn't be traveling, but you book a trip anyway and purchase the travel insurance, then it's unlikely to be valid, or voided. Sorry, it's likely to be voided, if you're just too ill to make these trips and you shouldn't have, thought to be traveling in the first place. There's a lot here. There's pregnancy is covered, any claim to do with childbirth. This is just a blanket exclusion for Covermore. And then claims involving, anything to do with drinking too much alcohol, and then, taking into account all sorts of other sort of medical advice that you failed to respond to, failed to listen to, and then claims arising from the failure of a travel agent, tour operator, or anything like that. Claims involving you traveling during international water, within international waters on a private sailing vessel or a privately registered vessel. So if you're out on a yacht, you went into international waters, then you wouldn't be covered for that. Claims around hunting, which we saw, of course, in Southern Cross, base jumping, hand gliding, polo playing, all sorts of things there. Claims involving participation by you in racing other than swimming or it looks like marathon or things like that. At the same time, climbing, uh, that is not part of. So that's not part of the allowances. So rock climbing would be a general exclusion. Claims involving participation by you in a motorbike that's larger than 250 cc's for any purpose. and then anything to do with snow skiing, snowboarding, or snowmobiling, and things like that. And then claims arising from, anything to do with COVID-19, with the exception of anything covered in the COVID-19 benefits. So that is a very intense list, which is definitely worth reading through. And then if I just go to one cover, they've got it in another format. So you can see that these pages are all incredibly long, and everything's very, very sort of detailed. But if I go through the cover more in a more sort of similar nature as to how I did the cover more, you'll be able to sort of make sense of it a bit more. So there's 4 pages of exclusions. Let's just sort of tackle some of the obvious ones. So you do not act in a responsible way to protect yourself and your property to avoid making a claim. So maybe you leave stuff unattended. Maybe you do something that just is going to be obvious that you're going to be worse off and incur a loss, and so you wouldn't be covered for that. And sort of other things, you're going to have to read through it in quite a lot of detail. But your claim arises from, say, errors or omissions in a booking arrangement, because you didn't get, say, the relevant visa, your passport's expired, you don't have the right some sort of document that you need, then you're not going to be covered there. You're not going to be covered if you've breached any kind of sanctions or laws. And then if you do anything illegally to break any sort of government prohibitions, including visa requirements, well, there's no cover there. And if if the government of some country detains you or confiscates something from you or destroys something, say you took in too much duty free and you didn't want to pay the excess and the stuff got taken, then, or sorry, confiscated, then you're not going to be covered for that, and all sorts of things as well. So anything to do with motorbike, we're looking at here 50cc. So it just shows you that some motorbikes are described as 250 or over. In this case, for one cover, it's 50cc. And then anything to do with a pandemic or with an epidemic, and they've sort of defined that there. And then sort of moving on, your claim arises to choosing to remain in a country and not to come back to New Zealand, then it wouldn't be covered there. And then anything to do with mandatory quarantine, lockdown, curfews, things like that, then there's no cover. And then you get into your sort of exotics like your nuclear reaction, the act of war, and then standard things like pre-existing conditions. So you need to understand if you have a pre-existing condition, you'll need to disclose that to the insurer and make sure that they understand it and make sure it's properly documented. And you may have to pay a certain extra premium charge. Usually you will to get that covered. And then if your claim arises from pregnancy, and whilst there is pregnancy cover within most of these travel insurance policies, if not all, and we have a separate video on that, as I previously said, there are some limitations on what is covered. So they have a whole pregnancy section there, and it's worth having a read of that section for any policy you are pregnant and planning to travel. And then basically they're going to exclude anything where you've been told not to travel and then you've gone and traveled anyway. So that's from the advice from your medical advisor, i.e. your GP or a surgeon or something like that. And then you arrange to travel where you know of circumstances that may lead to your journey being disrupted or cancelled. That's quite subjective, but they are going to assess that should you make claims. And then, if your claim is going to arise something to do with elective surgery or treatment overseas, then, that is, worth knowing about as well. Of course, that won't invalidate any claims from emergency medical cover. That's part of your policy, but it's just, this is the fine print for a reason, and it's really worth just going through it to make sense of it. I'm going to just sort of complete it here. You can see how exotic some of the stuff is. So if your claim arises from you or your traveling companion participating in any professional sport, and then you go into the sort of diving underwater, unless you're licensed, or anything to do with air supported devices, i.e., planes, charter companies, but that's not for licensed ballooning. There is so much to cover. It's really important that you just go through it. We don't want to see people declined, and you're going to have to print out the policies and just understand them, because it's not something you can read so much on a phone. We're going to bring out more guidance for this and just constantly kind of grow our video selections just to give people some hand holding and some insights into different policies, the comparisons between popular policies, exclusions, covering that now. There is so much to cover. So if you do have any general questions, of course, not specific to these policies, just in general, please leave them in the comment section below. It's really important that we make our guides and our resources as comprehensive as they possibly can be. So we want to do that by, putting updates in here and bringing out new videos if needed. Thank you very much for watching. Please, for making any travel insurance claim, it starts off with knowing the policy inside out. So please put in the effort to do that. We really want people to have positive outcomes from the unfortunate situation of having to make a claim. Thank you very much, and best of luck with your travels.